Achieving an A star in your unseen critical appreciations for women in literature is not easy. Following on from my previous videos, let's give you that final practice you need in order to achieve full marks. This time the extract will be from Kate Chopin's Story of an Hour, and I will give you a writing framework with pre-provided contextual sentences. What's not to like? Get the high grade with Schofield on Shakespeare.
We're gonna build a palace, and we'll be so proud. A palace where the roar of the crowd will tell the world our palace will last forever.
You know the mark scheme by now. This video will reference an unseen passage from Kate Chopin's short story, Story of an Hour. I will show the extract on screen, but it may be a little easier if you perhaps obtain your own copy. Type in Read Chopin's Story of an Hour into Google, click on one of the links. There's one from Virginia Commonwealth University. Hold down Control and F and type in Now Her Bosom. The passage ends with Life might be long. Remember that to have any chance of getting a decent mark, you need to have really got the passage. You have 1 hour and 15 minutes to do this essay, which is a decent amount of time, especially in comparison to the drama paper when you're writing about Shakespeare, including Measure for Measure. So I would spend at least 10 to 15 minutes reading the extract through, annotating and thinking. Press pause to do this now. The different sections of the extract will be shown at 5-second intervals. A reminder of my recommended essay structure. Press pause if you need to read this through again. Do you feel ready to have a go at writing your essay? Or, alternatively, I will share with you my contextual points, and your job then will be to come up with pertinent points about the extract, showing detailed understanding, textual quotation, and analysis. Time to make your mind up. In this writing framework, I've included some contextual insight mid-paragraph. Read this through and construct the rest of the paragraph, doing your section before and after. It's pause time. The same principle for the second main paragraph. Getting the idea? Yes, it's pause time. In this third main paragraph, I decided to explore contextual points in more detail rather than return to the extract. Of course, occasionally deviating from the paragraph structure is fine. If you're making a really good relevant point, stick with it and develop further. So, complete the first half of this paragraph. Press pause now. Time for my full A-star essay. In this extract, the narrator reveals a widow's mixed emotions following the death of her husband. On the one hand, there is a recognition of the sadness and the grieving process which will take place. However, the widow's feelings of joy are much stronger, as she is confronted with the liberating sense that she will be able to make all of her own decisions in her life from this point onwards. This extract gives an insight into the fact that many women felt stifled and repressed by overly rigid expectations for wives during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Mrs. Mallard clearly feels extraordinarily excited and liberated at the knowledge that she will no longer need to fulfill a solely domestic role as a wife. At the beginning of the passage, the writer refers to her bosom rising and falling tumultuously and states, she was beginning to recognise this thing that was approaching to possess her. This fascinating quotation suggests that Mrs. Mallard is so overcome with pulsing excitement that her breathing has become much louder and dramatic, hence the adverb tumultuously. Meanwhile, the reference to this thing possessing her suggests her lack of agency over her emotions. An external force, a sense that she is free at last, is gradually consuming her, meaning that crucially she should not feel guilty at her feelings because they are acting upon her. Such excitement following a husband's death is shocking and taboo-breaking. Nonetheless, it does give an implicit insight into the restrictions placed upon women and married women during the time. Legally, at the beginning of the century, women had few of the legal, social or political rights that are now taken for granted, and were mysteriously expected to feel fulfilled living primarily within the domestic sphere, something that the narrator of Jane Eyre rails furiously against when she suggests that it is now reminded in their more privileged fellow creatures to say that women ought to confine themselves to making puddings and knitting stockings, to playing on the piano and embroidering bags. Within this context, it is perhaps unsurprising that Mrs. Mallard exclaims "free" 3 times and feels the blood running vigorously through her veins. The coursing blood warmed and relaxed every inch of her body. Notice the reference to every inch. That this joy that she feels is physically liberating and relaxing every single tiny part of her. It is notable that her husband's death means that Mrs. Mallard can now look forward to her future. Following her period of grieving, she envisages a long procession of years to come that would belong to her absolutely. The noun procession is more typically used in ceremonies in which a great person or occasion is being celebrated. Processions typically move slowly, and so we get a sense here of Mrs. Mallard being able to savour this next stage of her life in a dignified way. Meanwhile, the adverb absolutely confirms her relief and delight of belatedly gaining full control over her decisions and actions. Just over 10 years following the publication of this story, Lily Bart tells Lawrence Selden in Warton's Age of Innocence that a girl must marry, a man may if he chooses. And the difference in the modal verbs gives an insight into the fact that many women felt compelled to marry for both social and financial reasons. Given this, it is therefore unsurprising that some women, such as Mrs. Mallard, end up feeling a guilty sense of relief following the death of their husbands. Unlike within today's Western world, in theory at least, women may have married not because they particularly wanted to, but because it was essential for their survival and the done thing. Now that Mrs. Mallard has the financially and socially secure position of a widower, she can, like Mrs. Jennings in Sense and Sensibility perhaps, live for herself. She no longer needs to prioritise men and children ahead of her own feelings and desires. It is important to stress that Mrs. Mallard's marriage was reasonably and conventionally happy. There was not the same sense that, post-marriage, she felt brainwashed and numb as a slave in some private totalitarian state. To quote particularly cynical about marriage, Esther Greenwood in Plath's The Bell Jar. The narrator references the husband's kind, tender hands and a face that had never looked save with love upon her. The adjective suggests that Mr. Mallard was gentle and affectionate and steadfast and constant in his feelings towards her. Mrs. Mallard's issue is not so much with her husband personally, but with the institution of marriage, which makes men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. The implication is that marriage leads humans to believe that they can dictate the behaviour and actions of their partner. Chopin clearly feels that this is degrading and erodes personal autonomy in a repressive way. In the passage, the writer suggests that both men and women can seek to control. Yet, of course, given men's superior status both legally, socially and financially, the expectation would be that a man's behaviour is likely to be more repressive than the female's, and this is something constantly seen in 19th century women in literature texts. From Angel Clare's disgusting hypocrisy when dealing with new wife Tess in Hardy's novel, to Dr. John's dictatorial nonsense in the yellow wallpaper, it's so hard to talk with John about my case because he's so wise and because he loves me so. Many women in literature texts show that the actions of married men can crush and destroy the lives of innocent, loving women. Of course, there is no sense in the story of an hour that Mr. Mallard confined his wife to her bedroom for hours on end, or refused to consummate his relationship with her following her revelation about a past indiscretion. Nonetheless, the fact that his death makes her feel as though she was drinking in a very elixir of life gives a stark illustration of the implicit inequalities within many 19th century marriages, which left some women feeling grotesquely unfulfilled. Doubtless Mrs. Mallard would agree with Jane Eyre's sentiments that women feel just as men feel. They need exercise for their faculties and a field for their efforts as much as their brothers do. Now that she is a widow, it would be easier for her to find such exercise and fields. As ever, in the introduction, don't waffle. Sum up key ideas and themes from the passage. Be as detailed and specific about the writer's language as possible, as I am here when I explore Mrs. Mallard's pulsing excitement and her lack of agency over her emotions. The best essays will flow seamlessly between individual sentences and paragraphs. The way that I begin sentences allows ideas to build on previous ones, allows me to develop and extend. It is notable that, meanwhile, comma, just over 10 years following, given this, comma, now that. Show that you are an expert on women in literature texts. I do this within my final sentence when I reference two very different texts to emphasise the fact that the actions of some married men can have a terrible impact upon the lives of innocent, loving women. My final reference to another woman in literature text helps provide a sense of finality. Mrs. Mallard's freedom chimes completely with the narrator of Jane Eyre's surprisingly feminist views.
This has been a Schofield on Shakespeare production, training you to get full marks for your unseen critical appreciations for A-level OCR Women in Literature. Many thanks for watching.